Hello everybody, this is Bird Brain. We're here, we are nerdy for the birdies. The Philadelphia Eagles are moving on to free agency starting very, very soon. They've already made a few moves already before, and there's plenty of moves to come as we move throughout the off-season process. So today we're going to kind of do a preview of all of the moves that the Eagles have made thus far, and look ahead to the moves that they could make in improving this team. There will be a stay or go section for all upcoming free agents, and of course I'll kind of go over the position groups after that and talk about potential free agent targets or things they should do for that position group for the offseason. Anyways, let's get into it because this could be a long video. So obviously we start off with the moves this week, and we had four key ones. The release of Darius Slay, the release of James Bradberry, the Saquon Barkley extension, and the re-signing of Zach Bond. So we're going to go over each move individually. We'll start off with the release of Darius Slay, which happened first. This was a move that was expected and was very heavily talked about down the stretch, probably from like the end of January. Slay was talking about the idea of like potentially not being back in Philly next year, which if he's talking about it, it means his agent is talking about it, which also probably means how he's talking about it. So it's a conversation that obviously had to happen. And he's an older guy, but the Eagles have a lot of youth in the cornerback room. We can see what they can do to help improve that. But as of right now, the Eagles have released Slay, and for similar reasons, they released James Bradberry, who didn't play at all last year, had a torn Achilles, but was a good sport about it. Obviously, we wish them both the best as they move on to the next channel, or they move on to the next chapter of their careers, after leaving the Eagles. But now we got to talk about the guys that are still here. Saquon Barkley signed a 2-year extension with the team. This was a necessary move. After the season he had, his value was going to go up, and if he had another season, it would go up even higher. And we knew that after this year, his final year was something that was cuttable. So if Saquon had been injured all year and had struggled, the Eagles could have cut him at the end of this upcoming season, and then they'd only have him for 2 years, and they could have moved off his deal fairly easy. They didn't want that, so they keep him locked up, and now your offensive core is locked up for the next 4 years. You've got Jalen, Devontae, AJ, Saquon, Mailata, and of course Landon Dickerson. And I expect at least one more player. We'll talk about who will be included in that group in a bit. And the signing of Zach Bond is big to keep this team together. Zach Bond was a great player. I mean, you have to think about it. He was an All-Pro. He was a Pro Bowler. He was in the Defensive Player of the Year conversation. He was involved in a takeaway / turnover in every playoff game this year. He was too impactful for this defense to let go, and he had a market, and the Eagles paid him. And I know a lot of people were shocked the Eagles paid him, but the fact of the matter is, when you have a talent as good as a Zach Bond, you pay him regardless of position. When you have a Saquon Barkley, you pay him. All right? I think the NFL is starting to realize it's better to pay the player and not pay the position. And we'll see what happens this free agency if that thought process continues, but I think that's definitely the philosophy that Howie has taken on. So before we go into now talking about what's to come, I'm just going to give like a very basic free agency prediction that I have. And I expect free agency to actually be relatively quiet for the Eagles. I don't expect them to make a lot of outside the organization signings that are like these huge big name players to add to the roster to get better. I don't think it's going to be like that. For a couple of reasons. And the biggest one being, a few weeks ago, Howie had a press conference, actually it was like last week, at the Combine, and he mentioned that he expected free agency to be a little quieter for fans this year, and that it may not be what we expect it to be, and that it may not necessarily be like the busy, always making deals kind of thing. And I think that's the right way to go about it. You have a lot of high-value free agents that are going to be leaving the building, so you might want to think about comp picks. If you don't know what comp picks are, if you basically lose a lot of high-value free agents in an offseason and you don't replace them with any, you can get potential draft picks based on a formula. It's a little complicated to explain, but that would come for the next year's draft. So we wouldn't get them this year, we'd get them next year, which would be huge. But I expect free agency to be fairly quiet. A lot of more one-year deals, cheaper signings, just kind of filling in gaps. I mean, the other thing is you have a really good team. I mean, this team was just in the Super Bowl. Even with losing talent, you don't have, like, glaring holes in the roster. I generally feel like if this team had to play a game tomorrow, they could field a team and they would be able to win fairly comfortably. I don't think other teams can right now. I mean, Seattle just traded their quarterback, for Christ's sake. We're in a pretty comfortable spot, so I think a lot of the building will happen later on in the offseason, more towards the draft. But, anyways, let's get into the next section. Now we're on to stay or go. Now, technically, I do have a player listed here that we already know the answer to, Zach Bond. But basically, stay or go here is basically where I take a look at players and I kind of determine should they stay and be re-signed by the team, or should they go and leave in free agency. So I wrote down several free agents off of, I'm not sure if it's pronounced Spot Track or Spo Track or whatever, I've heard both, but I basically wrote down all of the players that are slated to be free agents for the Eagles this year. So let's get into it. So the first one we have here is Josh Sweat, and Josh Sweat I have very simply as a go. I think he's a really good edge rusher, but a little inconsistent, and I just think his market is going to be a little too much for the Eagles to give him a contract. And the pass rush market's so interesting with the trade conversations and certain guys being released, and it's a deep edge class, so I feel like the Eagles don't need to go crazy to re-sign Sweat. I think a team will sign him for a pretty decent contract. Brandon Graham. We don't, as of this moment in time, I don't know what Brandon Graham's plan is. I assume he's just going to retire. So if he retires, that's obviously a go. If he doesn't, he's obviously, I assume they would just re-sign him and keep him. I don't know. We'll see. Just to make it quick, Zach Bond, I said stay. Obviously he's staying. Don't need to talk about that. Then we have Mekhi Becton. I have as a go. A lot of people, in the fan base think he should stay, and I would love him to stay. I think he was a nice addition for the offensive line. I just think about on the open market, especially with his versatility on the offensive line, being able to play tackle and guard. I just feel like there are teams that are going to give him a much bigger contract than maybe the Eagles would give him. So we'll see. It'll be interesting. And then we have Avonte Maddox. I said go just because older player. I could see the Eagles re-signing him in a later on in the offseason like they did last year, but I don't think he's a priority free agent that you have to get under contract right this second. So I think he'll leave. CJ Uzomah, pretty straightforward. I think he's a go. I don't think you're losing too much there. LaRaven Clark, I have a go. Not really much to there. Rick Lovato I have as a stay just because you need a long snapper and he's your long snapper. And pretty typically the last few years he's been a free agent. They just re-signed him with one-year deals. Fred Johnson. I actually have Fred Johnson as a stay. I do wonder if teams are going to give him some money, but I do think the Eagles, number one, I do think the Eagles really like him. Number two, I think he provides a lot of, he provides you, backup depth at tackle, and if you lose him, then you're really going to have to figure some stuff out there. I have Jack Driscoll and Nick Gates as go. Again, just backup depth. I could kind of see them in the category of they could bring them back later on in free agency. I just don't know how desirable they are at this moment in time. Isaiah Rodgers I have as a stay. And I think Isaiah Rodgers is interesting. There's been a lot of debate amongst Eagles fans on whether the Eagles should re-sign Rodgers or not. I think you can get Isaiah Rodgers for a relatively cheap contract. I think you can get him back in this building for cheap and have him battle with Ringo. Because at bare minimum, if Rodgers isn't starting, he's a good reserve corner. And if he is starting, then you're in a good position. I think irregardless, Quinyon is your CB1 next year, which that's great. You have Rodgers, who obviously has a lot of experience. Keeley doesn't have as much experience, but he has experience. So that's going to be a good battle. And you're going to need to sign a veteran anyway. And who better to sign than someone that already knows the system, already has familiarity and ties to the city. So I could see Isaiah Rodgers coming back. Britton Covey's interesting. Number one, he's a restricted free agent, so it's a little more complicated. The Eagles would have to, I believe, tender his rights first before they can decide to. If they don't tender his rights, then he'll be a free agent, which I think they haven't, so I think he will just be a free agent. It's a little complicated because he was a UDFA. So he will most likely. I don't know with Britton Covey because the injury last year is interesting. His biggest contribution is as a punt returner, and he's a good punt returner. But the Eagles also have other options. I mean, at bare minimum, they have Cooper DeJean. I don't think they want him to be the punt returner again. I think they'd rather keep somebody else at punt returner to keep Coop healthy for defense. But they have other options on the roster. We've seen Jahan Dotson do it. I remember last preseason, Anaya Smith was taking snaps there. And they could obviously just draft a receiver or something and have them do it. I don't know if Covey provides enough value for the offense to be able to come back, so I'm going to say tentatively go, but it's a bit of a question mark. Kenneth Gainwell, I expect to go. I just don't think the Eagles need to re-sign him. It's a really good running back class. You can draft another running back. You have Will Shipley. I think they may sign another veteran running back just for competition. We'll talk about that more later on in the video. And, yeah. Ben Van Sumeren, I have stay. He's in a similar situation as Covey's because he's a restricted free agent. I think Van Sumeren should be back. I think he provides good special teams depth. And he's taken those snaps as fullback. And from the conversation he's been having, it sounds like he's going to come back. So, because he keeps mentioning, I'm going to change my number next year, so I'll be able to not have to report as eligible. So it sounds like they'll probably bring him back, and I don't think he'd be very expensive. Paris Campbell, I think he'll probably let go. I think the locker room liked him, but I don't think he provides very much. I think you can find other talent on the wide receiver market, potentially. And then last but not least, we have Oren Burks. I'm going to have him as a stay. I think he provides some good depth at linebacker. He had a really good linebacker core, and he kind of came in clutch in case of injury. We don't know how healthy Nakobe Dean is going to be to start the year, and I could see a case where maybe he starts the year, and then maybe Nakobe's on the PUP list or something, and by week 5-ish, maybe he gets cut, Nakobe comes back, and then he takes his job back or whatever. But yeah, that is our stay or go. Obviously, we have a few questionable players. Anyway, let's move on to our next section. So our final section of this video is my positional group breakdown. So we have each position group. I have a lot of them I have potential free agents the Eagles could target if they so chose to. If not, they don't have to. We can see. Anyway, so first one is quarterback. And I'll be honest, there's been a lot of talk about what the Eagles should do with quarterback. I don't think the Eagles should do anything without being prompted by another team. When you have a good quarterback room, and the Eagles have a good one, you don't just trade guys because, Kenny Pickett's not that great, we need to trade him. I mean, I don't think Pickett's the best either, but as a backup quarterback, he's serviceable, and that's what you want out of a backup. There's a lot of sentiments like, we can just get someone else. Well, who? I don't know if you've noticed, but backup quarterbacks typically are making $5 million. And even if you give it to Tanner McKee, if you're signing a third, you're going to have to pay some money. And likely, your third string quarterback, if you're getting a dirt cheap one, it's like a Jeff Driscoll type, an Ian Book type that's going to be really cheap and also not that good. It's just what it is. Unless you just draft one or get a UDFA and you cross your fingers that they're really good. So there's no guarantee, and I kind of don't want to waste picks on a position we don't desperately need that. So if a team, I say you hold on to Pickett, because the thing is, if you try to shop him, you're not going to get value. If let's say the Eagles hold on to Pickett and we get to training camp, and some team somewhere has a bad quarterback injury, and now suddenly they need a guy. Now all of a sudden Kenny Pickett's a lot more valuable, and where before you might have gotten a fifth, now you can get a fourth, and maybe if a team's even desperate enough, you can get a third. You never know. So, in my opinion, don't be the ones, don't try to sell him, just wait for someone to try to buy him, and you'll get more value. So I wouldn't do anything there. In terms of running back in free agency, A running back I would love to target is Jamal Williams. Kind of a veteran back. He provides a little bit of a different skill set. Ugh, cannot talk. That the other running backs on the team don't currently provide. He's a little bit more of a power guy. He's a goal line back. You remember a couple years ago with the Lions, he had a really good season where I think he led the league in touchdowns that year, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, he had a good year as like that kind of goal line power back. That's what he was. I could see the Eagles signing him. He's a good vibes guy. He's a good locker room type guy. And I don't think he'd be very expensive. And he's somebody that, you know, you look at Will Shipley. I definitely think he's a back that, like, he needs to get space to run. Like, he needs to be able to run through space. He's not someone who's going to be able to do the dirty runs. And I just think about, like, towards the end of games last year, you really would have loved someone who's a little bit more physical that could just wear the defense out when, like, we're up by multiple scores. And then that way, they can come, Saquon can rest, take some carries off his back, and Jamal Williams can come in and do that. And I think, and because he's released, he wouldn't count against the comp pick formula, so that would be good for the Eagles to also target. Wide receiver I'd like to target is Devin Duvernay. Again, this is like if you don't bring back a Britton Covey type, I could see him as relatively cheap. He has experience returning kicks, and he has played in the league a little bit. I think he's a little bit better of a receiver than a Britton Covey. We just haven't seen Britton Covey get much action really at receiver, and a lot of his work was just quick screens, which other guys are on the roster that can do that. So I could see Duvernay as like a cheap receiver option to bring in, at least to bring in some competition to the room. For tight ends, it's such an interesting conversation. A lot of people have been talking about Goddard, and I'll be honest, I think the Eagles should extend Dallas Goedert, not by a long period of time, like another year or two, and then I would turn around and draft one. I haven't been a huge fan of the tight end free agency class. There's nobody in that I think is like a... But you have Goddard, you keep Calcaterra another year, and then you draft somebody, and then actually year, Calcaterra walks in free agency, you have Goddard, you have your rookie tight end, maybe you sign someone next year, or you just draft another one, and then you can build out your tight end core to develop for the next few years to come. So I haven't really named any tight ends here. I mean, Michael Mayer is someone that's been talked about in trades. Harrison Bryant is one that's a free agent. I mean, really in a tight end, you want someone who can block, because that was really their problem with this tight end core, was the blocking was not good, especially if Goddard was not on the field. Offensive line. Obviously, there's a lot of talk about Becton, but a move here for the offensive line. Number one, extend Cam Jurgens, and that's who I was referring to as the last guy to really be extended part of the core. He's your franchise center. I think that's already being negotiated. It's just a matter of when, not if, I think. I wouldn't be surprised if it was announced tomorrow. I wouldn't be surprised if it was announced, maybe Monday. But yeah, I think they're going to get Cam Jurgens done, get him figured out. But an outside the team free agent the team could target, how about Mark Lewinsky? Now, he's a little bit of an older guy, but he is a right guard. He has experience in Indy, so he overlapped with Sirianni. He was with the Giants for a couple of years, and then he just recently went back to Indy. He's an older guy. I don't think he'd be very expensive, and I know there's a lot of trepidation about Tyler Steen being the left guard or right guard, so we don't know, if it's going to be Steen this time stepping up or if it's going to be somebody else, but you bring the veteran in for competition, similar to signing Matt Hennessy last year, so we'll see what happens. For defensive line, I mean, there's been a lot of talk about this with the Myles Garrett trade and all that stuff. We'll see about the Myles Garrett trade. I don't think anything of the kind would happen before the draft, just because it would be very hard for Cleveland to trade him at this moment in time because of cap reasons. So really, it makes sense that they wait. But some other guys you can think about, you have Draymond Jones, who got released from the Seahawks. He wouldn't count against the comp pick calculator. You have Darrell Taylor, who has experience with Vic. Draymond Jones also has experience with Vic. Calais Campbell is somebody I've really wanted the Eagles to get. Just a big veteran presence on that defensive line. Especially someone to help mentor Jordan Davis and whatnot. That'd be great. For linebacker, I've kind of already mentioned the moves I would make there. You brought back Vaughn already. I would say just sign Warren Burks and Ben Van Sumeren. Just bring back your core from last year, and I think you'd be solid. For corner, I brought up Isaiah Rodgers, but if the Eagles can't get Rodgers, a player they could take a flyer on is Nate Hobbs, and I was very surprised. When I was looking on Spot Rack, or Spotrac, or whatever it's called, his value was very, very low. And I was very surprised, because I thought he was like a really good corner. And apparently, I think he didn't have a great season with the Raiders this past year. So I think I could see him coming on like a cheap prove-it deal, and he could come be CB2 with Quinyon. I think he can play inside it now. So I think he would be a good corner to bring in, again, to add to that competition, to see what he can do cheap, and I think he'd be that kind of a player. For safety, I didn't really put much here, just because the Eagles have a pretty loaded safety room already, just with a lot of guys in it. I mentioned Ryan Neal. He played for the Bucks. He was someone I wanted the Eagles to sign, I think, last year, and then I think he went to the Bucks then. He would be a good guy to kind of have in that room, just to kind of compete. Because the one thing is when it felt like Reed or CJ were on the field, the safety play got a little worse. Now you added Lewis Seen. I don't know if he'll make the final roster, but it's good to get him in here, see what he can do this summer, what kind of work he can provide. So that is the free agency preview. We've gone through all of the players. We've gone through some of the moves I would make. If you guys have any moves that you would make, let me know in the comments. But anyway, be excited, be patient. Remember, it's a marathon, not a sprint. We got a long way to go before the season starts, so you never know what the Eagles can do, when they'll make moves, and what kind of moves they'll make. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed being nerdy for the birdies. Fly, Eagles, fly, and see you guys around.